There's a moment in Luke's Gospel when the 72 disciples return from their mission trips, rejoicing over what they've seen God do. And we are told, at that time, Jesus, full of joy through the Holy Spirit, said, "I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth." Do you see that? Here is Jesus himself being empowered by the Holy Spirit to bring praise to God the Father. If Jesus was filled with the Spirit to worship, how much more should we be?
Wow, Holy Spirit of God in the midst of worship, it kind of triggers something inside of me. You could feel his presence where you have trembling bodies, your body kind of trembling in his presence. And sometimes, personally, I've experienced that I'm having tears in my eyes and, overwhelmed with the Holy Spirit of God when, real worship is going on. So it's awesome.
It's interesting. I think one of the ways the Holy Spirit really inspires me is actually in the preparation phases when I'm preparing the whole liturgy, thinking of the songs that we're going to be singing, thinking of the flow, thinking of the connection points.
One time when I led children in worship, I didn't know how to do it, so I kept going to God and saying, "God, how do I lead children in worship?" And he just said, "I need you to be available." And it was at a youth camp. There were 9 to 12-year-old girls. And then we started to worship. And these children just simply, we taught them before about worshiping and how they could do stuff. And then in the morning when we're having the worship, they started to bow down, raise their hands, and some were even crying and lying prostrate on the floor. And for me, that has been one of the most amazing experiences I've had in worship with children.
All true worship must be empowered by the Holy Spirit. Worshipping in the Spirit is not just for charismatic Christians, not just for young people, not just for those who don't enjoy planning. All of our worship is completely reliant on coming to God through Jesus by the Spirit. It's an invitation to join with the Trinity.
The Holy Spirit is also not something scary or someone we need to be super spiritual to engage with. Jesus says, "Which of you fathers, if your son asks for a fish, will give him a snake instead? Or if he asks for an egg, will give him a scorpion? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him?" Some people walk around feeling fearful about the Holy Spirit. They might be worried about losing control or experiencing strong emotions. But Jesus puts it in the least scary language of all, a hungry kid asking their dad for some food. It's expressed as an everyday family event, yet it's also profound in its simplicity. Love, nurture, and care is in that gift from father to child. So the Holy Spirit is a good gift from a good Father who loves us and wants the best for us. And all we need to do is ask. Not sing ourselves into frenzy or fast for a month or give more money in the offering or buy a better keyboard with just the right pad sound. Jesus says our loving Father will give the Holy Spirit if we ask.
Engaging with God's Holy Spirit doesn't begin and end at church on a Sunday morning. In fact, being open to God's presence is something that we need to practice on a daily basis in the mundane settings of our homes, our jobs, and our schools. If we want to hear God's voice on a Sunday evening, we need to start by listening to it on a Monday morning. If we want to meet with God when we stand on a stage, we also need to seek God in the secret place. I was once given a word of knowledge by someone in a prayer meeting. They told me that God said I was like an ornamental cabbage. If I'm honest, I didn't really find that the most encouraging word, and I wasn't even sure what an ornamental cabbage was until the same friends saw one in a florist shop and decided to buy it for me. So there I was with quite an ugly cabbagey plant on my desk at the church I work for. And I did what I do with all plants. I completely forgot to water it. A few weeks later, we entered our office to discover a disgusting stink. It took us a while to realise that the poor neglected cabbage was dying from the inside out. It looked okay from the outside, but inside it was putrefying. So it turns out I am like an ornamental cabbage. I can look good and holy on the outside. I can keep leading worship and praying and attending church events. But if I don't feed my soul, if I don't keep up my relationship with God in the secret places, I will start to die spiritually on the inside. And eventually that will start to stink. In the Gospels, we often see Jesus going away from the crowds to be on his own with the Father. He intentionally prioritizes time alone to refocus, to receive, and to be reminded of his true identity. Again, if Jesus himself needed this kind of retreat and refreshing, how much more do we? Pause the video to discuss or reflect on this question. What practices do you need in your life to keep watering yourself? How do you care for your soul and seek God's presence in the secret places?
Following the Holy Spirit doesn't necessarily mean that planning goes out the window. We can listen to the voice of God before a meeting, in our planning, or in our band rehearsals. But there's also something good about being open to the Holy Spirit during a service or in the moment. Paul says this to the Corinthians. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. There is a freedom to being reliant on the Holy Spirit as we lead, a sense of lightness and an ability to respond to the moment. It can give space for God to do a now thing, something he wants to highlight at that specific moment. It can also keep the worship leader mindful that they're not ultimately in charge and remind us to continually listen to God for his promptings. The word we would use to describe freedom in the Spirit is spontaneity. And this is the coming together of two things. Hearing God speak into the moment by the Holy Spirit and our ability to respond, communicate and act on that word. Both of these are important. We need to work on and develop our abilities on both sides if we want our worship, our services, our prayer times and our lives to be open to God doing things in the moment. We need to be listening out for what God is saying and at the same time develop our abilities as leaders and musicians in how we respond to what we've heard. In the final session, we will see how this looks in practice.
To close this session, we'd like you to think about that word reliant for a moment. What do you rely on when you come to worship? I know that I can get very stressed about whether the PA and the computer projection are going to work. So I expect that I rely on technology too much. Some people rely on their skills as a musician or as a leader, or on having everything planned out, or on using exactly the right words or liturgy. These are all good things, but they can become idols if we rely on them too much. What would happen if we took some of those things away? What if we relied on God's Spirit as the fuel of our worship? As a helpful exercise, you might want to consider stripping back some of the things that you rely on. Could you occasionally simplify your worship in some way? Would singing without a screen sometimes or without instruments help remind you to rely on God? Would planning a simpler service open up space for God's presence? Pause the video to discuss or reflect on these questions. What do you rely on more than the Holy Spirit to make your worship work? And are there things you could simplify in order to put your focus back on God?
Let's close this session by praying together. Holy Spirit, help us to rely on you. fill us and empower us to live like Jesus, and lead worship with freedom and freshness to the glory of God the Father. Amen.